Hello,
Hi,
Sarah.
Michael.
How are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Very good.
Good. I'm Sarah Posner. I'm Associate Editor of Religion Dispatches, and I'm here today with Michael Brendan Dougherty of the American Conservative. And I'll let you introduce yourself and tell our viewers whatever it is you want to tell them about your biography.
Oh, sure. I was raised in a really tiny wooden shack. No, I'm a writer at the American Conservative usually, and occasional contributor elsewhere, whether it's the All or my own blog. And
And where can people find your own blog?
it's at mbdougherty.com, and people will be able to find it. Just Google the name that you see above, or there's probably a link somewhere nearby. And we're here today to talk about some of the religion topics in the news.
Yes, and so let's start with the Pope and condoms. So last week, the Vatican newspaper published some excerpts from a forthcoming book by a German journalist. And in those excerpts, the Pope appeared to suggest that under some circumstances, the use of condoms would be morally acceptable. Now, I think that, the world was a little bit surprised by these comments, and in some sectors of the world, the surprise was pleased surprise. HIV prevention advocates talked about how this was a step in the right direction for the Pope to recognize that condoms are effective in preventing HIV, preventing the spread of HIV. But then over the weekend, the Vatican seemed to walk it back a little bit, and there was a different translation of the Pope's comments that was put out by the Vatican News Service. And so now it's not, to me at least, as we speak, clear what it was the Pope actually meant. Do you have any insight into that?
I don't have any new insight. There's a piece by George Weigel on National Review's site that apparently has whatever translation is out there. And to me, I thought there were two things interesting about that. And you bring up one of them, that the Vatican immediately saw the reaction of the world media and got really frightened of it. And I think for good reason. I mean, what we seem to know about what the Pope said was that, the suggestion was a male prostitute who has AIDS might use a condom to prevent the transmission of AIDS to his client. And that is needless.
But it was unclear whether his client would be a male or a female.
It was unclear. I mean, but what the Pope, it's funny because I think people reacted to it because the assumption is Catholics have a kind of superstitious belief, like as if latex itself was the evil of a condom rather than contraception. And, the Pope was just announcing a sort of, uncontroversial view that preventing the transmission of disease when there's no other question involved would be better than not preventing it. And it seemed extremely limited, but, it generated a lot of headlines, I think, because, a headline writer could say, Pope easing Catholic teaching on condoms or something like that, and it's very grabby.
Right, and he in no way changed Vatican teaching on the use of a condom for contraceptive purposes.
Right, and also, there's really questions about what is the level of authority of an interview.
That too, right. It doesn't actually change the official church teaching in any respect.
Right, I mean, this doesn't even rise to the level of a papal encyclical like Humanae Vitae in the 60s, which sort of announced the church's teaching against artificial contraception.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't even rise to that level, and even there's questions whether Humanae Vitae rises to a kind of ex-cathedra level where it's like an unchangeable doctrine.
But wasn't this a step forward for the Pope after his comments in 2009 about condom use in preventing HIV?
I think it's a good clarification, at least to some degree. I mean, I think it was funny because the Pope used an analogy. When I first read the comments, I didn't see the whole answer he supposedly gave, and I was trying to come up with an analogy, and he came up with it himself, where he said, if someone comes, or a robber comes, it would be better for him to have a gun with blanks in it than a gun with bullets in it. But the church is not supposed to be in a position of advising thieves how to go about their business. And I thought that was pretty much the perfect analogy that, if a thief were to begin using blanks and instead of potentially shooting and murdering victims of robberies, he would resolve not to murder them, then that would be what he calls the first step of remoralization. So I thought it was a good clarification because there have been Catholic bishops in Africa who have kind of spread some nonsense about condoms and about how they...
what do you mean nonsense?
Well, just, sometimes there's been bishops and priests in Africa who've said that condoms help spread the transmission or that there are tiny holes in them through which AIDS can get through. So I think it was probably useful on that level to get rid of that kind of superstition on that side. Mm-hmm. But as I said, I was surprised by the level of reaction. I mean, AP put this out on an alert. Like, if you have AP alerts on your iPhone, you got this message on Sunday.
Yeah, and I read it, and I thought it was, the original translation that I read was, I wasn't really sure what to make of it, because on the one hand, it seemed almost as if he was saying, if two males are having sex with each other and, say one is a prostitute, then it would be recommended to, or not recommended, but okay, to prevent the spread of HIV. And then I think there was some discussion after that. Well, what about women? Is it okay for a female prostitute having sex with a male client, and how does she protect herself from HIV? Not that I think the world's prostitutes really care what the Pope thinks about the use of a condom, to be honest.
Right. No, that's
which is the other weird thing about it, because it's sort of like, well, this is not exact. I don't think prostitutes, what the Pope thinks about what they're doing is high up on their high up on their list.
No,
but then today on NPR, they talked about how there was a new translation put out by the Vatican, which didn't say male prostitutes but said female prostitutes. So I think there's a lot of confusion about what the Pope said and also what he intended.
Yeah, and it's funny, one other little side thing to note is I noticed some commenters, like, on the internet, I think Andrew Sullivan and others, were taken aback, and I think this is such a prissy, faux outrage. They're kind of taken aback that, he's asked about condoms and all of a sudden he brings up male prostitutes or something like that, as if, like, the Pope shouldn't even utter the words prostitute or male. And there's kind of this funny... over moral outrage, like, well, what could the Pope possibly say about prostitution or anything like that, as if the New Testament wasn't full of, like, prostitutes itself.
Well, I guess the one thing I wondered if, because there are groups, NGOs or groups that are Catholic, that's, under the table hand out condoms to people because they're interested in obviously preventing the spread of HIV. And I wonder if these comments were intended, not for the individuals involved in the sexual activity themselves, but perhaps these public health folks who are helping them. And maybe the Pope intended to signal that, nod, nod, wink, wink. It's okay with me if you pass out condoms to those people.
I don't. That's a fascinating idea. I mean, I don't know. The Pope, I mean, to me, I feel like this is a journalist, Peter Sewell, who's pretty comfortable with. And so, it sounded a little bit like a bull session, like, okay, theoretically, and the idea that a male or maybe a female prostitute would be paying close attention to what the Pope says about this, it just seems so theoretical. And it seems like the question was just occasioned by the fact that there was previous media scrutiny of the Pope's words about condoms before.
Right.
So,
well, we're on the subject of the Catholic Church. Let's talk, move our focus to the United States and the recent elections in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Now, there was a bishop from Arizona who was in line to be elevated to be the president of the USCCB. Mm-hmm. And and that is sort of the standard tradition, as I understand it, is that the person who's next in line just generally gets elected to that position.
Right.
But instead, the conference elected Archbishop Timothy Dolan and also Bishop Kurtz, whose first name is escaping me at the moment,
Right.
Who are sort of considered culture warriors, and a lot of more liberal Catholic groups in the United States, particularly those who support LGBT rights, were extremely upset about this election and what it signaled in terms of the conference's position and advocacy on issues relating to LGBT and sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, Dolan is, reminds me a little bit of Cardinal O'Connor, kind of the famous socially conservative Archbishop of New York in the 80s and through the 90s. And one thing that I thought was interesting, though, is that, John Allen, the reporter over at National Catholic Reporter, he casts Dolan as in the group of what he calls affirmative orthodoxy, which is, holding the line strictly to traditional Catholic teaching, but trying to put the most friendly face on it possible, and the most engaging.
But if that's the case, why did these LGBT groups, there's a coalition called Equality Blessed, it's a coalition of four pro-LGBT Catholic groups, and there's a relatively newcomer group, Catholics for Equality,
Right.
which is all about LGBT rights. And it's actually was founded by a gay priest, Joe Palacios. So if Dolan has a friendly face, why do you think that these organizations reacted so negatively to his election? I mean, using language like, it signals that, reignition of the culture wars, or as if the Conference of Catholic Bishops hadn't already been engaged in that.
That's actually what's a little bit. I think Dolan is a little bit more, expressive of Catholic Orthodox positions on those topics than other bishops, and is a little bit less afraid of media controversy and the sort of tone of the culture wars. But there aren't many candidates, I think, that Catholics for Equality and these other LGBT groups would be, thrilled to have. I'm not...
Right, it's not like there's somebody who's in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops who would be for LGBT rights or for gay marriage, but...
There's some more liberal people, but they're on their way out, Roger Mahoney in Los Angeles.
Okay, right, sure.
Even Rembert Weekland in Milwaukee, who preceded Dolan there, who turns out to have been a gay man himself. I think there was a generation that was more liberal in their social attitudes today, but they're in their late 60s and early 70s and on the way out. And I think Dolan represents a kind of generational shift within the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops as well.
But it seems to be going in the opposite direction from the rest of the public and
Yes.
even Catholics.
Yeah.
So, because when you look at the polling data on people's attitudes towards gay marriage or even, in some cases of some religious groups, they're still opposed to gay marriage, but they're fine with civil unions. And when you look at the polling data, even evangelicals, who are the most opposed generally to gay marriage and civil unions, the younger cohort is... it's not an issue for them. They're fine with gay marriage or civil unions. Take your pick. And that's true of Catholics too. So how does the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops go in the opposite direction from who they represent?
Oh, well, I think what's happened is that, it's funny, in the 70s and 80s, the Catholic Bishops Conference, I think, tended to be more liberal than the average Catholic in the United States. And then
And was
80s.
that on these social issues,
Well,
or,
I mean,
or just on
the
social
social issues
justice?
were a little bit different,
Right? Exactly.
in the 60s and 70s. I mean, then you're talking about race and civil rights,
Right.
And
war.
blacks, equality, racial equality, and I think that the bishops then were a little bit considered to the left of the average Catholic. And back then the average Catholic was considered the unmeltable white ethnic, and that's very different now. And but the conference has changed dramatically. I mean, guys like Mahoney and Weakland before them, they were, I always bring this up, I feel like when we talk, but they were of that Vatican II generation that saw themselves as sort of a new church that was open to the world in a way that the church hadn't been previously. And I think that's over now. I think 20 years or more of hardcore pro-life activism, the pontificates of John Paul II, and now Benedict XVI, you're attracting a different kind of person to the seminary now.
Well, maybe it's not even that you're attracting a different kind of person, but that you're keeping those other people, those stalwarts of the 60s, out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's part of it, too. I mean, it's very clear, one thing that's been very noticeable in Benedict's appointments, this is near and dear to my heart, is that he tends to elevate bishops to higher positions if they have a favorable view of the traditional Catholic liturgy, and that's usually a very telltale sign that they're in favor of, a very strict application of traditional Catholic teaching on sexual mores and sexual morality. So, that is a change in the church. I mean, I think it's unbelievable how quickly this change has happened, actually. Usually, it seems like these changes happen over a century, and this one's happened in a generation.
Well, it's interesting to me, as somebody who covers religion and politics, this seeming disconnect between the Catholic hierarchy and rank-and-file Catholics. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't a good, strong segment of Catholics, particularly white Catholics in the United States, whose political beliefs are in line with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but they certainly don't, especially on these so-called culture war issues, don't represent, in some cases, even the majority of rank-and-file Catholics. I think on the abortion question, it's kind of more split down the middle. But that provides us maybe with a good segue to the next thing we wanted to talk about. Was Public Religion Research Institute did a post-election survey of voters, of people who actually voted in the midterms, and asked a bunch of questions relating to religion and the voters' perception of both parties and religion, and President Obama and religion. And they and a couple of analysts at Brookings Institution, E.J. Dion and Bill Galston, concluded that Obama has a religion dilemma, suggesting that given what this polling data shows, that religious voters are, I'm trying to summarize it, in a fair way, that religious voters have issues not just with Obama's religion, but with his politics as well.
Right.
And it was interesting to me that, they took this polling data and concluded that Obama has a religion problem without taking into account what might be causing these voters' perceptions of Obama and his religious beliefs, and in his religious beliefs in particular. Because I think that there's a lot at play out there in the media world that's influencing voters' perceptions of Obama's religion, and that's been going on since, early 2008, if not before. And, going back to Jeremiah Wright, rumors that that Obama is Muslim and so on. False rumors, I should add. And it's a curious question to me because I don't think, and I wrote about this last week at RD, I don't think that, it doesn't seem to me that, they seem to suggest that, Obama has an issue, that he's got to placate these religious voters, as opposed to saying, well, this is their issue with him. Maybe there's an approach that he can take that can dissuade them from this, as opposed to feeling worried that whatever he does might offend them. And that seemed to be the takeaway for them, and that didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
No, I'm actually as skeptical or more skeptical than you are of this line of thinking. I mean, it's a replay of the sort of 2002, 2004 meme that, Democrats have to talk about their faith more. And I think it's true in one sense that liberalism has shed a little bit of the sort of highfalutin Martin Luther King style biblical social justice rhetoric. I think that's true, but I think everyone's minimized that a little bit. I actually think there aren't that many people on the right that sort of are, deep in the sort of biblical American political rhetoric either. It's a new thing on the right, and so the left has lost that, and also I almost can't even use the word elite anymore because of the Tea Parties. But, I think the elite in the Democratic Party is also demonstrably less religious than the average American. It's just secular people.
But do you think, I guess it depends on what you mean by the elite.
Yeah.
I think that many elected Democrats are quite religious. If you look at the Democratic Party leadership in the House, for example, Nancy Pelosi, even though obviously there are some bishops who would deny her communion because she is pro-choice, but she's a devout Catholic. Jim Clyburn is a very religious person. So you could tick off a lot of Democratic elected officials who are not only not hostile to religion, but are very religious themselves.
Right. No, I think that's true. It's just, I think perception is exaggerated, but I think there is some reality. I mean, if you look at polls of where secular Americans tend to line up politically, it's overwhelmingly with the Democratic Party.
Although they, like almost every other demographic group, moved a little bit into the Republican column in the midterms. But
yeah, no, that's true too. And actually, it shouldn't be such a surprise that a lot of Republican and a lot of conservative higher ups will allow themselves to be thought of as religious when, privately they don't have really strong convictions about religion at all. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right to be a little suspicious that, this was a replay in 2004. They were saying, Democrats have to learn how to talk about faith. Mm-hmm. And actually there's some pretty ham-fisted attempts to do that. And it was mocked actually pretty widely.
Right. I think it's not successful with anybody. It's not successful with the part of the Democratic base that is secular. It's not successful with the part of the Democratic base that's religious, because the religious part of the Democratic base they're not, I don't want to say they're not evangelical, because there's a small part of it that is evangelical, but they're not evangelistic. And I think that conservatives viewed it as insincere.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases it probably
was.
It literally was, pollsters said, start talking about your faith,
right.
And then a couple of people tried, and it was lampooned. I just don't think Obama should be held to a standard, of having to win over the Republican base as, it's a problem that he hasn't won over base Republican voters.
Right.
I think he should try to mitigate. Politically, it would be wise of him to try to mitigate damage in the middle.
And I think, to be fair to Galston and Dion, I think that that's what they were suggesting, that there's this little bit of, swing voter middle, sort of moderate Catholics, mainline Protestants, and so on. But I'm not convinced that they would be persuaded by religious talk. I think that those voters who moved into the Republican column this cycle, it was the economy. And that was acknowledged at the Brookings presentation where all of this data was discussed. But one of the things that they zeroed in on, which was fascinating, was this data point where the respondents were asked a survey question about American exceptionalism, and the question was phrased something like, do you think that America was found, that God intended America to be an exceptional nation? I'm paraphrasing it. I might have gotten it slightly wrong, but that's that was the gist of it. And the majority said yes, and there was a high correlation between those who said yes and those who favored, muscular foreign policy, favored, the use of torture in detainee interrogations. So there seemed to be, obviously a high correlation between that and, conservatism, not a certain kind of conservatism, the hawkish kind of conservatism, not necessarily, say, the Ron Paul kind of conservatism.
Oh, yeah. It's funny, that faith in American exceptionalism, I'm actually surprised there isn't more pushback among evangelicals leaders. I think of Dr. Moore and others who have hinted at it, but...
You're talking about Russell Moore at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Yeah, he's hinted at it, but
I think he's more than hinted at it. I think that he has serious issues with it. He told me, I interviewed him a couple months ago, right after the Beck rally, and he told me that he thought that a lot of kids who were educated in Christian schools or homeschooled and very much steeped in that Christian nation ideology were in for a rude awakening when they got to college and found out that it was totally wrong.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it is a kind of mythologizing of the founding. And listen, a lot of people mythologize the founding for a lot of different reasons. There's all sorts of ways to go about it. But, I would like to see Russell Moore and others do what they can. You would have to classify American nationalism as a kind of heresy within the Christian church. It's almost to the point where... This is going to sound so overheated, but I think it's true. A lot of Christians worship the nation state. Mm-hmm. And they don't worship God. They worship the nation state, the American nation state, and attribute to it a righteousness and historical mission that is so opposed to Orthodox Christianity. This is the sort of thing that would make Augustine gag. You can't read the City of God and then go in for that ham-fisted view of American exceptionalism that empowers the nation-state to remake the world.
But I think that in the evangelical world, at least, that view has been reinforced in this strange way by Christian Zionism, that these expeditions abroad are framed as, an epic battle between Western civilization and Islam.
Yeah.
And so that, it doesn't color just their take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the war in Iraq, a possible war with Iran. It's all framed in this epic global battle. Even, I think, for some who aren't primarily motivated by their scriptural view of the end of days, but just from this view of America being this exceptional protector of Western civilization. It really is about that. From what they perceive, they believe is a threat from global Islam.
Yeah, it's amazing how it works. I wrote a piece on Christian Zionism a few years ago when John Hagee came to Washington, I think the first time, with his group Christians United for Israel.
Right.
And, there's an old, I refer to this, there was an old George Orwell essay about transferred nationalism, which was a lot of people can't manage to be nationalists about their own nation because they're just too acquainted with its flaws and its people to believe that any nonsense about it. And so they transfer their nationalist feelings onto another nation. So, historically, G.K. Chesterton, the Catholic writer in England, did this for France. He was constantly talking up, French military nobility and virtue. And it's something he would never have done about his own England. And I think a lot of Christians, they look at America and they still feel somewhat alienated from what they view as its decadent culture, culture of death, etc. And so they end up transferring their nationalistic feelings onto Israel. And, I'd love to give them a weekend in Tel Aviv. Disabuse them of some of this notion, but
well, back to this polling data, and whether Galston framed this as that this what he perceived to be a majority view on American exceptionalism, a divinely inspired American exceptionalism. He framed it as an uphill battle for any Democrat who wants to challenge this narrative. Now, I have to say that polling data all by itself wasn't enough to convince me of that, because that polling data was taken in this period where so many people have been exposed to Beck, bringing on people like David Barton to his show and talking about America as a Christian nation and so on, in his black-robed regiment. But even apart from Beck and whatever reverberations his show had in a certain segment of American life, the Tea Parties and the Christian right. I mean, this was a theme that I saw covering conferences throughout 2010.
Yeah.
It was repeated at the Values Voter Summit. It was repeated at Ralph Reed's first conference of his Faith and Freedom Coalition. It is the new frame for conservatives who see this, we shouldn't talk about gay rights and abortion because the Tea Partiers don't really want to talk about it. So let's talk about this frame of America being a divinely inspired, exceptional nation. So I think that in that climate, in that where all of this was brewing, I think it's hard to detach that poll answer from that, and for the Democrats to say, oh, we must follow along with that, otherwise we're going to lose elections, I think is just a huge mistake.
I think it's a mistake, too. I also think the poll number is a little bit nonsensical in itself, too. I think it reflects exactly what you say it reflects. But I also think these polls, people answer them just saying, oh, if I say no, I must be saying something bad about America.
That's true, right. They don't want to admit
something bad about America. Sure, yeah, it's divinely inspired, and then they go on and, jump in their Prius and vote Democrat. I mean, so I don't think that is as much of an uphill battle. I do think, though, that brand of nationalistic messianism is really dangerous, and particularly as it relates to our foreign policy. I mean, you saw how all those strains blended together in the case for the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was going into a Muslim, it appealed to a certain type of Christian because it was taking it to Muslims halfway around the world. It appealed to a certain kind of nationalist because we were going to make the democratic dominoes fall throughout the Middle East. And it's funny, too, because supposedly Glenn Beck has been exposing them to the dangers of Wilsonianism. But this is exactly the kind of super Protestant globalism that Wilson preached a century ago, and now it's become this.
I think that we can safely conclude that Glenn Beck is not a historian.
He's not a historian. He's not systematic. I think he's dangerous, but I think he's charming in the way that he learns about something over a snack in the afternoon and then puts it on his program that night. Yeah, I mean, there really does seem to be an energy about him that is crazy, and I don't know, he's fascinating. God love him.
Well, I think we're going to get to Beck in a moment, but one of the things that I wanted to also bring into this conversation, and this raises this a little bit, this question of, is the Tea Party concerned with the quote-unquote culture war issues, the social issues, but we were going to talk about that, but then you brought up this question of war and foreign policy and hawkish foreign policy.
Yes.
And it made me wonder, I saw a little bit of discussion last week about, do progressives and Tea Partiers have some alliance that could be forged on decreasing defense spending, because of course the Tea Party is concerned with government spending, and progressives think that there's too much spending on defense. So even though we have this perception that the Tea Partiers fall in line with this view of American exceptionalism, I do think that this divine American exceptionalism, I do think that there's a segment that's more, let's just say for shorthand, in the Ron Paul camp on foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Rand Paul has said very explicitly that defense spending should be on the table for cutting.
But how influential do you think that is, in not just in the Tea Party, but in the conservative movement and in the Republican Party in Congress right now?
Well, I mean, I've seen, you saw a couple weeks ago, Bill Kristol and a couple of other guys, their names slip my mind right now, wrote an editorial that don't cut defense spending, and they sort of made a case that, so I think there's a fear among some Republicans that there might be some defense spending cuts.
It's sort of the traditional isolationist neoconservative split.
Right, and I think...
But the Tea Party's not going to change that?
I actually think the culture war actually plays into this, too. I actually think a Republican president could convince a much broader majority of conservative Republicans to commit to some defense spending cuts.
Who would that Republican president be?
I don't know, but I'm just saying a hypothetical one, a Chris Christie, in
okay, that's an interesting,
2014 or 2017. Could maybe convince us, a Marco Rubio maybe, or, I don't know who. But I think if Obama...
You don't think Rubio's already falling under the influence of the...
Oh, no, I'm sure that most of these guys are going to get snatched up into the neoconservative mold pretty quickly if they are threatening otherwise. But I think just the dynamics of our politics, I think a Republican president could get a large part of the base behind him on that. Even against the objections of the professional conservative movement. I think, however, if Obama proposed serious defense spending cuts, I think it would be easily portrayed by the professional conservative movement, the Rush Limbaughs and the radio hosts, as an anti-American strength, capitulatory gesture. And I think that would work on certain conservative base instincts to bring them into opposition. I mean, I think most Republicans are somewhat, they're instinctive on defense. And so if you say that, well, America's giving up an inch, they will say, hell no.
But you don't think the spending issue can be brought to bear on this? I mean, when you think about not just the amount of money we spend, on our own military, on the troops, but the amount that is spent on contractors who are in many cases corrupt, incompetent, overreaching.
Oh, yeah,
I mean that seems to me it's a perfect Tea Party issue, isn't it?
But the thing is, you should know as well as anyone that anti-spending on the right is often tied to culture issues. So, it's the welfare queen in her Cadillac. So I would love it if a credible politician could say that there's the welfare general in his Humvee that we have to get rid of, or the welfare contractor.
The contractor, really.
Oh, yeah, well, sorry, I'm going to get killed for saying welfare general, but no, I mean, I would love to see that. I mean, listen, in the past decade, defense spending has gone up 9% every year, year over year. It is, we have maybe 783 or more foreign military installations.
Are the days of lambasting the $4,000 toilet, or remember that? Are those days over? Do we just not go there anymore? It just seems like such fertile ground, and such fertile ground for conservatives if they want to be consistent and honest about this spending issue.
I would think so too. I mean, I worry about the $4,000 toilets issue. I think is kind of a dead end in the sense that I tend to look at Bonnie Frank likes to say that there's no budget line item, waste, fraud, and abuse that you can just cut. But there are, the fat in a budget is usually marbled in. So, I mean, you have to, I don't think there is a way of just trimming the fat. I mean, I think you have to get down to the, to the limbs and the bones if you're going to trim defense spending. I mean, the question is, for defense spending, is what is America's mission in the world? And that's what no one's talking about. It is as expansive as ever and will continue to expand.
But I think that's why it's a mistake for Democrats to listen to this advice about the American exceptionalism argument being an uphill battle for them. I think that instead of viewing it as an uphill battle for them against this conservative, it's not all conservatives, but this particular conservative take, instead of creating their own narrative about what is what is our vision for America's role in the world. I mean, I think that is like a much more fertile and productive and meaningful road to go down than fretting about what the conservatives think about American exceptionalism.
Right, and I also think it's just, I think on foreign policy, a lot of voters respond to things that engage their imagination, for good and for ill. So I think you can, I think you can say, as was said, America can make the Democratic dominoes fall, and people will believe that. They'll begin to imagine how that might happen. And I think on the other hand, you can say, hey, America shouldn't be the world's, global narcotics cop or the world's global, riot police. And that would work too. And I think that would have an appeal. I mean, I think one of the weird secrets of our politics is that foreign policy is one of the only parts of our politics that doesn't sort very well across parties.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a broad, so the supposed, we call them moderates in the Democratic Party and moderates in the Republican Party are usually in strict agreement about America's expansive role. And then there's this teeny tiny non-interventionist, isolationist rump in the Republicans. And there's this kind of marginalized, hated Peace Now part of the Democratic coalition. And those people just tend to be excluded as completely unserious.
Which is...
from the debate.
I think is a little bit of a function of tactics more than ideology. I mean, I think there are more Democrats than you would think who would fall into that camp, but aren't comfortable wouldn't associate themselves with, say, Code Pink, even though what Code Pink wants is pretty much what they want.
Right. Well, I think there's a fear, hawks are very good at portraying war as an utterly serious, this is adults talking now, issue.
And only you unserious people don't really understand that.
Right. And I just think People for Peace I'm with Elvis Costello. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? There's nothing ridiculous about trying to make peace. And it's the responsible thing.
Well, speaking of making peace, let's go on to one of our other topics, because we alluded to briefly in this whole discussion of does Obama have a religion dilemma. Right. We alluded to the reignition of the culture war issues, that were downplayed because it was portrayed during the campaign as being an issue that's not top priority for the Tea Party, or the economy was taking the top billing. But it doesn't mean that some of these issues haven't gone away. And one of them, obviously, is abortion.
Right.
And recently, last month, at Princeton, there was a big conference on common ground on abortion. And there were, the most serious thinkers on both sides of this issue. And the idea, as I understand it, was to, not re-engage the old debates that they're never, and acknowledge that there were, people who are pro-life and people who are pro-choice, and we're not going to debate that, but we're going to try to find this place where we can agree on certain things, which to me seems like a perfectly doable proposition in the abstract, but bring it to Washington and bring it to Capitol Hill and bring it to the White House, and it probably isn't really going anywhere in terms of legislation or policy.
Yeah, I thought, I thought this conference was fascinating. that it happened at all.
And it was called, if I recall, Open Hearts.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was fascinating that this even happened, and maybe unthinkable a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think you're right that once you try to translate this into politics, it all falls apart. But I think it falls apart philosophically as well. Will Salatin over at Slate had 2 articles sort of like what pro-lifers should take away from this and what pro-choicers should take away from this conference and sort of the lessons you have to learn. And I thought his piece was wrong for almost everyone. And I thought it was interesting. He told pro-lifers to give up on the legal battle against Roe, and then told pro-choicers to maybe give up on third trimester or second trimester abortions. Well, those two things don't go together. Roe as it's interpreted now, protects second and third trimester abortions. So those two don't go together. And I also think that he recommends the embrace of contraception.
Mm-hmm.
And this cuts in 2 interesting ways. So I think superficially that sounds like an appealing idea. But you're asking 2 different things. I mean, what pro-choicers want to reduce abortion is they want fewer unwanted pregnancies, right? So that would mean contraception.
Right. And sex education.
And sex education. What pro-lifers really want, and they don't use this language enough, but what pro-lifers really want is they want more wanted children. That creates it's impossible to encourage both. If you focus so intensely on contraception, we know, the studies show that people fail to use contraception perfectly. So that by then you have made a young person, maybe it's not a young person, terrified of being pregnant and terrified of becoming a mother because you're trying to encourage them to contracept better than they currently are. That will lead to an abortion.
Well, I don't know that you're making them terrified of becoming a mother. Maybe terrified of facing a situation that you're not prepared to face. I mean, it's, just, we know that people want to have sex before they're ready to become parents. It's just a fact.
Well,
I don't think you can deny that's true.
Well, no. Well, they do. I mean, I'm not saying...
Right.
I want $1 million before I start the day to work, too. I mean, but you cannot... What I find so interesting is that, pro-lifers portray themselves as hard-headed moralists, right? So they think, hey, we're announcing the moral absolutes here. But their success, politically and culturally, has all been about sentimentality. So their success is always about sentimentalizing the unborn child. And pro-choicers portray themselves as kind of like open and tolerant and ready for anything. And now they're trying to desperately moralize contraception. And, it's funny, Salatin kind of touches on this, but there's a point where you can moralize contraception so much that you're actually still stigmatizing abortion or stigmatizing, supposedly unprepared pregnancy.
Stigmatizing it how? Making it seem like you failed at the contraception?
This is the thing you have to desperately avoid. You have to...
Do you really think that's the messaging?
I do.
I just don't agree. I mean, I think it's so... I actually think that the messaging is a little too clinical.
So, are you saying you would like it to be more moral?
No, see, I don't want that either. But, I mean, it's one of those things, obviously, sex and sexuality is, either if you make it too clinical, you don't want to make it too clinical and you don't want to make it too moralizing. So you have to find that space in between, where you're providing the clinical information, but you're not making it seem so clinical that there's no other factor involved other than, physical desire. But I just think that the discussion about contraception, in a way, for it to make it into the policy realm and into, say, if the imaginary, and I say imaginary, it's on paper, but it's imaginary as a law, the Ryan DeLauro bill, which was introduced in the last Congress as a way of reducing the number of abortions or reducing the need for abortions. That whole language split points to some of the stuff that you're talking about. But I think that that everybody has to acknowledge that contraception is the most effective way of preventing unwanted pregnancies, because you can moralize about abstinence and you can talk about abstinence, but the reality is very different from that. And I think that you can provide, funding for sex education and funding for contraception through healthcare reform or what have you, or through Title X, which the right demonizes, without getting necessarily too thick in the weeds on the moral things. I mean, it's just a reality that people have sex. If they're going to have sex, the contraception will prevent an unwanted pregnancy, and the prevention of unwanted pregnancies leads to fewer abortions.
Right. Well, one of the things I think is interesting is, and Ramesh Ponnuru criticized Salatin over this. He said that, the studies show that 50% of abortions are repeat abortions. So apparently the first abortion didn't have whatever the drama and difficulty, emotional, physical, of the first abortion didn't have a sufficient effect on the woman or the woman and her partner to use contraception to prevent the further one. So the idea that if Jerry Falwell and Archbishop Timothy Dolan started to encourage contraception, people would be more likely to do it. Like, as if that's the missing key here, is, if only Timothy Dolan and the Catholic Church would get behind contraception, people would use it.
I don't think that that's even true, because I think that, at least among married Catholics, something like, 97% of them use contraception regardless of what the Catholic Church's teaching is.
Sounds high, but, that sounds high, but I'm just saying that it's not...
And the 50% repeat sounds high to me.
Yeah, I was taking that from something in Salatin's piece, mm-hmm. But I think, I just think there is no common ground. I mean, I'm not in the promote contraception camp, because I believe that does encourage people to fear pregnancy and child rearing to the point where they will commit an abortion when they fail with their contraception. And I think also there's a little bit of unreality in the debate, because I think the debate is not going to be solved in the next 10 or 15 years, and I don't think the technology related to contraception and abortion is going to remain static. And I think there can be revolutions in the near future that change this debate very quickly. Anyways, if I were to game out the future, I think emergency contraception or chemical abortions are going to become so much more advanced that I do think surgical abortion would likely fade away as and be stigmatized as the sort of option for the irresponsible person who not only failed to contracept but failed emergency contraception.
Or the option for the poor person.
No, exactly. And I think that's exactly how it'll be stigmatized, is like poor, meritocratic failures get surgical abortions. And it will begin to be phased out as people grow more and more kind of disgusted with them. And I'm not painting a very rosy picture of human nature, but I think that's how these things work. And my fear long term is that contraception will be so... the rhetoric Will Salatin uses and others use about it is so moralized now that I worry about it becoming a kind of... There being a lot more incentives made to use contraception, or in the future maybe temporary sterilizations and other things, so that...
But But why do you? I mean, obviously, anything has a moral component to it, right? Any kind of, war is bad. The other things that we talked about earlier. But it seems that that your political and moral views, that you've laid that on the discussion, which should really be kind of more of a public health discussion on the use of contraception. That because of your moral views, you have painted that as a moralizing point of view.
Well, I mean, I'm just seeing, Salad and others talk about contraception in the terms of personal responsibility and doing the responsible thing. They don't talk about it as like a health issue, like are we, able to get a condom to a 18-year-old or 16-year-old.
Well, I view it more as a health issue. I don't think it's healthy for 16-year-olds to have babies, and I would much rather see. If a 16-year-old is going to have sex, and I'm not saying,
You're not saying which 16-year-old should be having sex right now?
Or I'm not saying that, it's a great thing that 16-year-olds have sex, but they do. And
Where?
And I think that you can't deny that that's going on. And given that that that's going on, I think giving them the tools to prevent an unwanted pregnancy from strictly a public health perspective is a much healthier thing for our society. Is that a moral point of view? Yeah, I suppose it is. But there you have it. I can't fathom that people think it would be a great thing that a 16-year-old has a baby.
Right. Well, I can't think people would think, it'd be a great thing if a 16-year-old does fail to use their contraception perfectly well enough, which does happen. People with sex education still apparently fail to use it correctly. They forget to take the pill. They don't have a condom. They don't use it one time. They think they're counting the days right, whatever. And they become pregnant, and then then the idea is like they're so shamed because they're so irresponsible to have failed to use their contraception. But
who's doing the shaming?
What?
Who's doing the shaming, do you
think?
I
think it's a number of things. I think it's public institutions, like, kids at school would do this. I think parents of a teen who's pregnant might do this.
But that's the problem, right? The shaming, and it's the shaming of the girl.
Well, yeah, no, it's almost always the shaming of the girl, and I think also, but I think that's why I was trying to say that there's a conflict between trying to prevent unwanted pregnancies and trying to create a situation where more unborn children are wanted. So if people come to expect that there will be no problem pregnancy, they're going to be much less likely to offer a 17-year-old girl the kind of support that she might need if she doesn't initially want to have an abortion. So her parents say, well, this was your total failure of responsibility, so now we've got to use this means to take care of it. And so that's what I said. There's a fundamental difference. If conservatives want to win the culture, let's put aside the legal question on abortion,
right?
They have to make more children that are conceived wanted. And I think trying to go about that by preventing unwanted pregnancies through contraception will not be effective at that higher end. So that's why I don't think it'll work, and I do think technology, contraceptive and abortive technology, is going to interrupt the debate again at some point in the near future.
I think we're a long way away from that.
I don't know.
Interrupting the debate, at least. But I think that what you're saying is I just think that...
Sorry, I came with something totally different and new on that.
No, it's interesting because I've had the common ground debate so many times that it's more interesting to have something new to talk about.
Right, I just don't think there fundamentally is common ground. And also, I think on the pro-choice side, isn't there a failure to... if you read the essay in N+1 a couple years ago about repressive sentimentality, or I forget which one, but, there is an element of liberals and pro-choicers who say abortion is not bad. And some of them say, as was said in N+1, that it's a good thing. And, I don't think that's true. But, there's some people that view this as a fundamental part of their freedom. If you, a lot of these common ground people, they point to Europe as a place where there are legal regimes where abortion is somewhat restricted, but generally tolerated. And I think there are a lot of Americans who say, no, this is a right. I think there are a lot of American women and pro-choice people that say, this is fundamentally a right. And, if I want to have an abortion at 8 months...
But you're saying that it's because of that there could never be common ground?
Well, I just think that there's a segment on the pro-choice side that is implacable to talking about this in anything other than rights language.
I don't know. I think that there may be, but I think that the institutional pro-choice community is totally amenable to talking about the common ground. Actually, I think it's that to a point where some of its base is unhappy about it. But I think that they're framing it totally in terms of what I talked about, the prevention of unintended pregnancies, because that keeps the self-determination for the woman intact. If you're going to talk about preventing unintended pregnancies through contraception and sex education and so on, it doesn't do any damage to that. And I think that from the pro-life side, it doesn't do any damage to their argument either to say, let's, if we're going to create a new life, let's do it responsibly and let's do it when we're ready. And, and I think that there's more sort of evangelicals moving into that camp because they don't have the
they don't have
the Vatican teaching to have to continue.
Right, but the other thing with the institutional pro-life movement is that the Catholic Church is such a tremendously large and important part of it,
right.
And also Catholics tend to supply the intellectuals and the legal minds that staff these groups, so that's a problem there. No, I think it's I just think it's irresolvable. I think there's not only I'm of the view that philosophically there's a problem and culturally there's a problem with reconciling and finding common ground, and then politically I think it's utterly impossible. Once you pull this out of the salons in Princeton and put it into partisan politics.
Well, it wasn't clear that it was successful at Princeton either. I think there was some dispute afterwards among some of the participants. But, I agree that politically it's extremely difficult because I think with the Ryan DeLauro bill, which, was co-sponsored by two Democrats, one is pro-life and one is pro-choice, but only by Democrats. And it had support from some figures in the religious community, but I still think that it involved a huge expenditure of money, and it was just embedded with so many different provisions that somebody would find a problem with, that there's no way that this would ever pass. But I think that the point of it was to say to the world, we made this effort to find common ground, and here it is. But then there wasn't a huge effort to get a piece of legislation because politically it's just not viable.
Yeah, or to build on it. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what there is to build on. And as I said, I think the pro-life movement is confused. I do think, I guess I'm one of these unmeltables that doesn't think contraception works as an answer for the pro-life side. I think it's a capitulation to the pro-choice side in a way that preserves choice and preserves, the gains of the sexual revolution, but that it's precisely those that are corrosive to what the pro-lifers want to do.
But I think that an acknowledgement, at least you're willing to acknowledge that, right? An acknowledgement that unhappiness with the sexual revolution lies at the core of the reason why this common ground is so difficult to find.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's the fundamental sticking point.
Listen, it's just a different... that's why I think culture is the word to use for it, and culture war is the word to use. There's just a completely different set of priorities and values and morals that inform, a family that, someone can. It's just I don't even know. I'd be almost explaining too much to say it, but it is a completely set of different morals where if you're going to try to end abortion by using contraception and making people, as I said, I think it's about making people afraid of becoming pregnant and worried about it to the point that if they do, then abortion becomes eminently logical, even where it wasn't beforehand. And then on the other side,
I just don't agree with that.
And then on the other side, becoming pregnant when you don't want to, but you have the support system of the father and the support system of parents to help you bring this child into the world and then raise them, because they have an expectation that, hey, someone's conceived a child, now everyone has a responsibility. I mean, it's the idea that really what lies in it is the fundamental idea that is sex a private thing that people can enjoy on their own, or is it a thing that has dynamic social implications for everyone around you? So that, is the decision to have sex, outside of marriage, is that just something that's my personal choice? Or is it something that could affect everyone around me, my parents, my aunts and uncles, my boyfriend, my girlfriend?
Well, I mean, you can say that about any kind of human behavior. Like anything you do, you could frame it in terms of this affects everybody around me. If I decide to drive a car without a license and drive drunk, that's going to affect everybody around me. That's not just my personal choice. I mean, so I think that you're wrong about the notion that the pro-choice movement, or at least the pro-choice contingent of the Common Ground movement, makes it scary to be pregnant. I just think that it's a question of having a baby when you are ready to have a baby and creating life. And some people in even on the pro-choice side, especially in the religious pro-choice side, will talk about, life being sacred and talk about it in terms of, creating it responsibly. And so I just think that it's not fair to say that the pro-choice side is making pregnancy seem like a scary thing. I mean, pregnancy is a really awesome thing.
Yeah.
And, should be, having children should be done when you can, you have all of the capacities and tools to actually take care of.
Well, see, that's exactly where I think the danger is in saying that. Because whose responsibility is it? I feel like you're putting a burden on childbearing that it can't support. I mean, people all over the world have children in much desperately poorer conditions than we have them here.
Well, that's true, but I mean, it hasn't necessarily been good for the, good for people. People are, born into terrible poverty. And, obviously my first priority would be to end poverty so that people wouldn't be born into poverty. But, if you can prevent, through preventing unintended pregnancies, the birth of a child into poverty by parents who aren't ready to take care of the child, I don't see why that's a moralized.
How invasive and coercive should you be about that? How many poor...
I'm not suggesting being invasive and coercive. I'm suggesting providing the tools to people.
Would you be willing to provide disincentives to poorer people to have children?
Like what?
Like raising their health insurance rates if they do not use oral contraception or something like that.
No.
Okay. Well, because that's where I think the danger of this rhetoric is going, is that, all you poor people, you're not responsible enough to have children. We're going to have to start coercing and regulating and providing incentives for you to behave the way we want you to behave.
No, that is not where I'm going.
I hope not. I'm not saying even you, but I'm just saying that I feel like this is the imperialism of white liberal Protestants on everyone else. Is like, everyone's better have their lace curtains before they have a kid. And
oh my God, no. I mean, I am not. No, not at all. I just think that. There are many reasons why people feel unready for parenthood, and poverty isn't the only one.
Right.
And so, I think that for the conservatives to say they think that abortion is terrible, but they want to defund Planned Parenthood, whose work, a tiny fraction of its work is providing abortions. A much bigger portion of its work is providing family planning services to people. And so for the conservatives to say they want to defund Planned Parenthood because they want to decrease the number of abortions is completely backwards. So what I'm saying, all I'm saying is organizations like Planned Parenthood provide people with the tools to prevent an unintended pregnancy. And it's completely disingenuous of conservatives to say that they want to decrease the number of abortions, but they also want to defund Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I mean, it would be tendentious for me to try to argue with that. I mean, I'm happy to see abortions prevented. I'll just end it there. I'm not prepared to say anything about Planned Parenthood that would be amenable enough to close on. So.
Okay. Well, we probably should close because we've been going for a while.
Yes.
But, we actually didn't talk about that much religion.
Well, we talked about social issues.
Yeah.
They're related to religion. And people
Right.
think abortion is a religious issue, so...
That's true.
Anyway, it was a pleasure, though.
Same.
And we'll do
and I'm
it
really
again
glad we
soon.
did it. Yes. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.